The year was 1865, and New York City sparkled like a jewel in the American crown. The Civil War had ended, leaving the nation wounded but wealthy men hungrier than ever for power and gold. In the grand mansions that lined Fifth Avenue, the richest families in America lived like European royalty, building palaces that made kings jealous. The air in New York smelled of coal smoke and opportunity. Horse-drawn carriages clattered down cobblestone streets while men in fine silk hats made deals that would shape the destiny of millions. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Gilded Age, when everything that glittered seemed to be gold, and the powerful believed their reign would last forever. In the heart of this golden world stood William McGeer Tweed, though everyone simply called him Boss Tweed. At 42 years old, he was a mountain of a man, standing over 6 feet tall with a thick beard and eyes that missed nothing. His most famous feature was the enormous diamond pin that sparkled on the front of his shirt, catching the light like a star fallen to earth. That diamond alone was worth more money than most families saw in a lifetime. Boss Tweed sat behind his massive oak desk in Tammany Hall, the headquarters of New York City's Democratic Party. The building itself was like a temple to power, with marble columns and gold-framed paintings of past politicians who had ruled the city. But none of them had wielded the kind of control that Tweed now possessed. He was the undisputed king of New York politics, and he made sure everyone knew it. Every morning, a parade of visitors came to pay their respects to Boss Tweed. Contractors seeking city work, judges hoping for favorable appointments, and businessmen needing permits all lined up outside his office. Each one left a little poorer, having paid their tribute to the man who controlled their fate. Tweed had built what he called his ring, a network of loyal friends and associates who held every important position in the city government. If you wanted anything done in New York, you had to go through Boss Tweed first. His mansion on Fifth Avenue was a monument to his success. The 3-story brownstone house had rooms filled with expensive furniture imported from Europe, paintings by famous artists, and enough crystal chandeliers to light up a small town. His wife Mary Jane and their children lived like nobility, attended by servants and surrounded by luxury. Tweed owned real estate all across Manhattan, from the bustling docks to the fashionable uptown districts. Every piece of property made him richer. Every rent payment added to his growing fortune. But Boss Tweed was not the only titan ruling New York's golden world. Across town, in an office that overlooked the busy harbor, sat Jay Gould, perhaps the most feared man on Wall Street. At 33, Gould was thin and pale, with dark eyes that seemed to look right through people. Newspaper writers called him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, comparing him to the devil himself for his ability to make and destroy fortunes with a single decision. Gould had started with nothing and built his empire through pure cunning. He understood that information was more valuable than gold, and he made sure he always knew things before anyone else did. His railroad companies stretched across the country like iron spider webs, carrying goods and people while filling his pockets with profit. When other businessmen played checkers, Jay Gould played chess, always thinking several moves ahead of his opponents. His partner in both business and mischief was James Fisk, though everyone called him Jubilee Jim. Where Gould was quiet and calculating, Fisk was loud and flashy. He dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, with diamond rings on his fingers and gold chains across his vest. Fisk loved the good life, spending money on expensive restaurants, fancy carriages, and beautiful women. He threw parties that were talked about for months with the best food, finest wine, and most entertaining guests in all of New York. Together, Gould and Fisk controlled the Erie Railroad, one of the most important transportation companies in America. They had fought fierce battles with other wealthy men, including the legendary Cornelius Vanderbilt, and had won through a combination of legal tricks, bribery, and sheer determination. Their offices were filled with maps showing their railroad lines, stock certificates worth millions of dollars, and safes containing enough cash to buy small countries. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, now 73 years old, watched these younger men with a mixture of admiration and concern. The Commodore, as everyone called him, had built his fortune the hard way, starting with a single ferry boat and turning it into a transportation empire that spanned the continent. His steamships carried passengers and cargo along the nation's rivers and coasts, while his railroads connected cities and towns across the growing country. Vanderbilt lived in a mansion that was the envy of New York society. The house had ballrooms large enough to hold hundreds of guests, libraries filled with leather-bound books, and art galleries displaying paintings worth small fortunes. His family had grown accustomed to the finest things in life. His children and grandchildren wore clothes made by the best tailors, ate food prepared by skilled chefs, and traveled in private railroad cars that were more luxurious than most people's homes. The Commodore had accumulated wealth beyond imagination. His fortune of $100 million made him the richest man in America, and his family believed that money would last forever. They built more mansions, bought more art, and threw more elaborate parties, never thinking that such wealth could ever disappear. The Vanderbilt name had become synonymous with success and luxury. These powerful men moved through New York society, like gods among mortals. They attended the same exclusive clubs, married into each other's families, and made deals that affected millions of people they would never meet. At the opera, they sat in golden boxes where everyone could see them. At restaurants, they occupied the best tables and ordered the most expensive wines. Their wives wore jewelry that sparkled brighter than stars, and their children grew up thinking that luxury was their natural birthright. The common people of New York lived in a very different world. In crowded tenement buildings downtown, immigrant families worked long hours for wages that barely kept them alive. The streets smelled of garbage and horse manure, while diseases, like cholera and tuberculosis, claimed thousands of lives each year. Children worked in factories instead of going to school, and many families could not afford enough food or warm clothes for winter. But these wealthy titans rarely saw the suffering below them. From their mansion windows, the city looked beautiful and prosperous. The problems of ordinary people seemed as distant as the troubles of people living on the moon. They believed that their success proved they were better and smarter than everyone else, chosen by fate to rule over the less fortunate. As 1869 approached, these masters of the Gilded Age felt invincible. Boss Tweed's political machine grew stronger every day. Jay Gould and James Fisk planned ever bolder schemes, and the Vanderbilt fortune continued to multiply. They built higher towers, bought larger diamonds, and dreamed bigger dreams. The Golden Age seemed like it would last forever, and they were its undisputed kings. None of them could imagine that their glittering world was built on foundations as fragile as morning frost, or that forces were already gathering that would bring their golden towers crashing down around them. The spring of 1869 brought warm sunshine to New York City, but underneath the golden surface of the Gilded Age, dangerous cracks were beginning to show. The powerful men who ruled the city still felt invincible, but their greed was growing larger than their caution, and their schemes were becoming bolder and more reckless with each passing day. Jay Gould sat in his office on a bright May morning, studying charts and numbers that most people would find impossible to understand. His thin fingers traced lines on a map showing gold movements across the country. For months he had been developing what he believed would be his greatest scheme yet. Not content with controlling railroads and manipulating stock prices, Gould now wanted to corner the entire gold market of the United States. The idea was breathtakingly simple and incredibly dangerous. There was only about $20 million worth of gold circulating in the country at any given time. If someone could buy up enough of that gold, they could control the price and force it to rise as high as they wanted. Then they could sell their gold for enormous profits while everyone else scrambled to buy what little remained. But there was one huge problem with this plan. The United States government owned vast amounts of gold stored in treasury vaults. If President Ulysses Grant decided to sell government gold, it would flood the market and destroy any attempt to corner it. Gould needed to make sure the government would keep its gold locked away while he executed his scheme. This was where Gould's genius for corruption came into play. He had discovered that President Grant's sister Virginia was married to a man named Abel Corbin, a small-time speculator who was always looking for ways to make easy money. Gould approached Corbin with a proposition that would make both men rich beyond their wildest dreams. Corbin was a thin man with nervous eyes and sweaty palms, who had never been successful at anything in his life. But he had one thing that made him incredibly valuable to Jay Gould. He was family to the President of the United States. Gould offered Corbin a partnership in the gold scheme, promising him millions of dollars in profit if he could use his family connection to influence Grant's gold policy. The plan required careful preparation and perfect timing. Gould arranged for Corbin to set up social meetings where he and Fisk could spend time with President Grant. They would talk about economics and farming, gradually convincing the president that high gold prices would help American farmers sell their crops overseas. If they could persuade Grant that selling government gold would hurt the country, they might keep the treasury vaults locked long enough to complete their scheme. James Fisk threw himself into the conspiracy with his usual enthusiasm. He saw it as the ultimate game, a chance to outwit not just other businessmen but the entire United States government. Fisk began buying gold quietly through trusted brokers, careful not to let anyone know what he was doing. The price of gold started to rise slowly, just a few cents at a time, not enough to attract attention, but enough to show that the scheme was working. Meanwhile, Boss Tweed was becoming drunk on his own power. The success of his political machine had made him believe he was untouchable. Every contract the city awarded, every job it filled, every decision it made went through Boss Tweed first. The money flowing into his pockets had grown from a stream to a river to a flood. Tweed's latest project was the renovation of the New York County Courthouse, a building that would become a symbol of his incredible greed. The original budget for the courthouse was $250,000, which was already a large sum of money. But Tweed saw an opportunity to steal on a scale that would make his previous corruption look like pocket change. He arranged for the courthouse contracts to go to companies owned by his friends and associates. These companies would then bill the city for vastly inflated amounts, with the extra money being split between the contractors and the Tweed ring. Marble that cost a few dollars per square foot was billed at hundreds of dollars. Carpets worth hundreds were charged as if they cost thousands. Every nail, every board, every piece of hardware had its price multiplied many times over. The courthouse project became a money-making machine for Boss Tweed. Month after month, the bills grew larger and more outrageous. What started as a $250,000 project eventually cost the city more than $13 million, and the building was not even finished. Most of that money went straight into the pockets of Tweed and his associates. The boss used his stolen wealth to live like an emperor. He bought more real estate, invested in businesses, and lived in luxury that amazed even the other wealthy men of New York. His diamond pin grew larger and more spectacular, his mansion filled with expensive furniture and rare art. His family traveled in style and wore the finest clothes money could buy. But success was making Boss Tweed careless. He no longer bothered to hide his corruption or worry about what people might think. He believed that his control over the city government and the courts made him immune to any consequences. When reporters asked questions about city spending, Tweed would laugh and tell them to mind their own business. The Vanderbilt family continued their own form of excess, though theirs was legal. Cornelius Vanderbilt's children and grandchildren had grown up surrounded by wealth, and they spent money as easily as breathing. They built new mansions that were even more elaborate than their fathers. They collected art, jewels, and rare books. They threw parties that cost more than most people earned in a year. Young members of the Vanderbilt family began to gamble heavily, betting enormous sums on horse races, card games, and stock investments they barely understood. They believed their fortune was so large that they could never spend it all. Each generation seemed determined to live more luxuriously than the one before, never considering that even the largest fortune could be exhausted if spent foolishly enough. While the rich men grew richer and more reckless, ordinary people in New York began to notice that something was wrong. City services were getting worse, even as taxes grew higher. Streets went unrepaired, garbage piled up in poor neighborhoods, and the police seemed more interested in protecting wealthy criminals than catching real thieves. A few brave newspaper reporters started asking difficult questions about city finances. They noticed that simple projects were costing incredible amounts of money and taking far longer to complete than they should. But when they tried to investigate, they found that city records were often missing or obviously fake. One reporter in particular began to attract attention for his criticism of Boss Tweed. His name was George Jones, and he worked for a small but growing newspaper called the New York Times. Jones had started writing editorials questioning why city projects cost so much money and where all that money was really going. At first, Boss Tweed ignored these newspaper attacks. He had dealt with hostile reporters before, usually by bribing them or having them arrested on fake charges. But Jones seemed different. He could not be bought or intimidated, and his questions were becoming more specific and more dangerous. Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist who worked for Harper's Weekly magazine, also began drawing unflattering pictures of Boss Tweed. Nast's cartoons showed Tweed as a fat pig feeding at the public trough, or as a vulture picking the bones of the city clean. These cartoons were particularly dangerous because even people who could not read could understand their message. Boss Tweed tried to laugh off the criticism, but privately he was beginning to worry. He knew that his corruption was so massive that it could not stay hidden forever. The courthouse project alone involved so much stolen money that it would be impossible to explain if anyone ever got access to the real financial records. Jay Gould and James Fisk were also attracting unwanted attention. Other businessmen were beginning to notice the rising price of gold and wonder what was causing it. Some suspected that someone was trying to corner the market, but they had no idea how large the conspiracy really was or how high up it went. As summer turned to fall, in 1869, the three most powerful men in New York were about to put their greatest schemes into action. Boss Tweed's corruption had reached levels that would shock the entire nation. Jay Gould's gold conspiracy was ready to make him the richest man in America, or destroy him completely. The Vanderbilt fortune continued to flow out of the family, like water through a broken dam. None of them realized that their golden age was about to end in the most spectacular crash in American financial history. The morning of September 24, 1869, dawned crisp and clear over New York City. Nobody walking the streets that day could have imagined they were about to witness one of the most devastating financial disasters in American history. By sunset, fortunes would be destroyed, lives would be ruined, and the golden dreams of the Gilded Age would begin their spectacular collapse. Jay Gould had been awake since before dawn, pacing back and forth in his mansion like a caged tiger. For months, he and James Fisk had been secretly buying gold, pushing the price higher and higher. Their conspiracy with Abel Corbin seemed to be working perfectly. President Grant appeared convinced that high gold prices would help American farmers, and the government had stopped selling gold from the treasury. But the night before, Gould had received terrible news. A trusted source told him that Grant had discovered the conspiracy and was planning to order a massive sale of government gold. If this happened, it would destroy Gould's scheme completely, and probably bankrupt him in the process. The man who had always been one step ahead of everyone else now found himself trapped in his own web. Gould made a desperate decision. He would try to sell his gold secretly before the government announcement, while continuing to buy publicly through his agents. This way, he might escape disaster, while his partners and the thousands of other speculators who had followed his lead would be destroyed. It was a betrayal that would save his fortune but damn his reputation forever. James Fisk had no idea of his partner's treachery. He woke up that Friday morning feeling like the king of the world. For weeks he had watched the price of gold climb steadily upward, making him richer with each passing hour. He dressed in his finest clothes, put on his most expensive jewelry, and headed to the gold room on Wall Street, ready to celebrate what he believed would be the greatest triumph of his career. The gold room was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Located in a basement beneath the stock exchange, it was where all gold trading in America took place. The room buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of brokers, speculators, and clerks shouted orders and made deals worth millions of dollars. A giant chalkboard displayed the current price of gold, and every eye in the room watched those numbers like sailors watching a storm. When trading opened that morning, gold was selling for $160 per ounce, the highest price anyone had ever seen. Fisk's agents immediately began buying more, pushing the price even higher. Other speculators, seeing gold rise so dramatically, rushed to buy their own shares, creating a feeding frenzy that drove prices toward astronomical levels. But upstairs in government offices, President Grant was making final preparations for his counterattack. He had spent sleepless nights deciding what to do about the gold conspiracy. Grant was an honest man who hated corruption in any form, and he was furious that people had tried to use his family connections to manipulate government policy for their personal profit. At exactly noon, the president gave his order. The Treasury would immediately release $4 million worth of government gold onto the market. This was an enormous amount, enough to flood the market and drive prices down instantly. Grant knew this action would cause panic, but he also knew it was the only way to stop the conspiracy and protect the American economy from further manipulation. The news hit the gold room like a thunderbolt from heaven. One moment, brokers were celebrating as gold prices soared toward $165 per ounce. The next moment, a messenger burst through the doors, shouting that the government was selling gold. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Within minutes, the price of gold collapsed from $162 to $133 per ounce. Panic swept through the room like wildfire as hundreds of speculators realized they were about to lose everything. Men who had been millionaires that morning found themselves bankrupt before lunch was served. The screaming in the gold room could be heard 3 blocks away. Grown men wept openly as they watched their fortunes disappear. Clerks frantically tried to calculate losses that were too large for their adding machines to handle. Some brokers simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the speed and scale of their destruction. James Fisk found himself at the center of the chaos, owing millions of dollars on gold contracts he could no longer afford to honor. But instead of accepting responsibility for his debts, Fisk made a decision that shocked even his enemies. He simply refused to pay. He declared that all his gold contracts were invalid and walked out of the gold room, leaving hundreds of other investors to bear the losses from his deals. The panic spread far beyond the gold room itself. The stock market crashed as investors rushed to sell everything they owned to cover their gold losses. Banks called in loans, businesses closed their doors, and ordinary people who had invested their life savings in gold stocks watched their money vanish like morning mist. The disaster reached far beyond Wall Street. Farmers across the American West saw the price of their wheat and corn crops fall by 30% in a single day. Foreign trade stopped completely as international buyers refused to accept American currency that might lose value from hour to hour. Railroad companies that depended on crop shipments faced immediate financial crisis. At least one man committed suicide that day, jumping from a window rather than face the shame of his bankruptcy. Others would follow in the weeks and months to come as the full extent of the damage became clear. Families who had been wealthy that morning were reduced to poverty by afternoon. Some of Wall Street's most respected brokerage firms, companies that had been in business for decades, closed their doors forever. The crash bankrupted judges, ministers, doctors, and businessmen who had trusted their money to what seemed like a sure thing. Even people who had never bought gold found themselves ruined when banks that held their savings collapsed under the weight of gold-related losses. Jay Gould, through his secret selling, managed to escape financial ruin. But his reputation was destroyed forever. Word soon spread that he had betrayed his own partners and abandoned the thousands of smaller investors who had followed his lead. Newspapers called him the most hated man in America, and he would never again be welcomed in respectable society. Boss Tweed watched the chaos from his office in Tammany Hall, congratulating himself on staying away from the gold market. But he failed to understand that Black Friday marked the beginning of a new era in American politics and business. The public was no longer willing to tolerate the corruption and manipulation that had made the Gilded Age possible. Reform movements were gaining strength, and investigative reporters were asking harder questions than ever before. The Vanderbilt family also suffered losses from Black Friday, though their enormous fortune protected them from complete disaster. However, the crash served as a warning that even the largest fortunes could be wiped out by poor decisions and changing times. Some family members began to worry about their reckless spending, but others simply gambled harder, believing they could win back their losses. As the sun set on September 24, 1869, New York City looked like a battlefield. Broken men wandered the streets in shock, while others gathered in angry crowds outside banks and brokerage houses that had closed their doors. Police patrols were doubled to prevent riots, and the National Guard was placed on alert in case the situation got worse. The Golden Age was ending, though few people realized it yet. Black Friday had shown that even the most powerful men could be brought low by their own greed and ambition. The age of unlimited corruption and manipulation was coming to an end, and a new era of regulation and reform was about to begin. The men who had seemed so mighty just 24 hours earlier now faced an uncertain future, and their golden towers were starting to crumble around them. The months following Black Friday brought a cold winter to New York City, but the chill that settled over the Gilded Age elite was far deeper than any weather could create. The golden confidence that had carried men like Boss Tweed to incredible heights was beginning to crack, though the most powerful among them refused to admit that their world was changing forever. Boss Tweed seemed determined to prove that he was still untouchable. Instead of becoming more careful after the gold panic, he grew even bolder in his corruption. The disaster on Wall Street had actually helped him in some ways, because it distracted people from asking questions about city government while they worried about their own financial losses. Tweed saw this as an opportunity to steal even more money, while everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. In 1870, Boss Tweed achieved what he considered his greatest political victory. He forced the New York State Legislature to pass a new city charter that gave him almost complete control over New York City's finances. The new charter created something called the Board of Audit, which sounded official and important but was actually just Boss Tweed and his closest associates with the power to approve any spending they wanted. With this new power, Tweed's corruption reached levels that would have seemed impossible even a few years earlier. The Tweed Ring developed new and creative ways to steal money from the city treasury. They created fake companies that existed only on paper but received millions of dollars in city contracts. They bought supplies for the city at normal prices, but billed the government for 10 or 20 times what they actually paid. They hired workers who never showed up for their jobs but collected paychecks anyway. The courthouse project became the crown jewel of Tweed's corruption empire. What had started as a simple renovation had turned into the most expensive building project in American history. Every month brought new bills that grew larger and more outrageous. Tweed and his associates split the stolen money among themselves, with the boss taking the largest share of every crooked deal. Boss Tweed used his stolen wealth to live like an emperor. He bought a yacht that was larger and more luxurious than some hotels. He owned racehorses that competed in the finest tracks across the country. His mansion grew even more elaborate, filled with art treasures and furniture that cost more than most people earned in their entire lives. His famous diamond pin became so large and spectacular that people could see it sparkling from across a crowded room. But while Boss Tweed celebrated his success, forces were gathering against him that would prove stronger than all his political connections and stolen wealth. The corruption had grown so massive that it was becoming impossible to hide, and there were people in New York who could not be bought or frightened into silence. One of these people was a city clerk named Matthew O'Rourke, a quiet man who kept the financial records for many city projects. O'Rourke had worked for the city government for years, and he had watched with growing horror as the corruption got worse and worse. He saw fake bills, phony contracts, and stolen money, but he had been too afraid to speak out because he knew what happened to people who crossed Boss Tweed. The Black Friday disaster changed O'Rourke's mind about staying silent. He had seen how the greed of powerful men had hurt thousands of ordinary families, and he decided he could not stand by and watch the same thing happen with city money that was supposed to help poor people and improve neighborhoods. O'Rourke began secretly copying financial records that proved how much money was being stolen and where it was going. At the same time, George Jones at the New York Times was becoming more determined than ever to expose the corruption he knew was happening. Jones had tried for months to get proof of Tweed's crimes, but city officials always claimed that financial records were lost or confidential. The newspaper editor knew he was fighting a powerful enemy, but he also knew that someone had to stand up for the truth. In the spring of 1871, O'Rourke made a decision that would change American history. He contacted the New York Times and offered to give them copies of the real financial records that showed exactly how much money Boss Tweed and his associates had stolen. The records were so detailed and damaging that they would make it impossible for anyone to deny what was happening. O'Rourke's evidence was like a bomb waiting to explode. The record showed that a simple courthouse renovation had cost the city over $13 million, with most of that money going into the pockets of Tweed and his friends. They proved that the city had paid $40,000 for brooms and mops that cost $40. They showed payments of over $100,000 for furniture that was never delivered and repairs that were never made. George Jones and his reporters spent weeks studying O'Rourke's evidence, making sure they understood every fake transaction and stolen dollar. They knew they would only get one chance to publish this story, because Boss Tweed would use all his power to stop them if he learned what they were planning. The newspaper prepared its attack with the care of generals planning a military campaign. Meanwhile, Thomas Nast at Harper's Weekly was also preparing his own assault on Boss Tweed's empire. Nast's political cartoons had been growing more savage and more popular with each passing month. His drawings showed Tweed as a fat pig, feeding at a trough filled with taxpayer money, or as a giant octopus with tentacles reaching into every part of city government. These cartoons were particularly dangerous because even people who could not read could understand their message perfectly. Boss Tweed tried to stop both the New York Times and Harper's Weekly through his usual methods of bribery and intimidation. He offered George Jones $5 million to stop publishing critical stories about city government. When Jones refused the money, Tweed had city inspectors visit the newspaper office looking for building code violations that could be used to shut it down. He also tried to have Jones arrested on fake charges and threatened to cancel all city advertising in the New York Times. Thomas Nast received similar treatment. Boss Tweed's associates offered the cartoonist a fortune to take a long vacation in Europe and stop drawing unflattering pictures. When Nast refused, they threatened his family and tried to have him fired from Harper's Weekly. But both men were determined to continue their fight against corruption, no matter what it cost them personally. The Vanderbilt family continued their own decline during this period, though their fall was slower and less dramatic than the crashes happening around them. The younger generation of Vanderbilts had grown up believing that their fortune was unlimited and that they deserved to live in luxury without working for it. They spent money on gambling, parties, and expensive toys with no thought for the future. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself was growing old and increasingly worried about what would happen to his fortune after his death. He could see that his children and grandchildren were spending money faster than his businesses could earn it, but he seemed powerless to change their habits. The family that had once been famous for hard work and careful business decisions was becoming known for waste and extravagance. Jay Gould and James Fisk found that their reputations had been permanently damaged by Black Friday. Other businessmen no longer trusted them, and many refused to do business with them at all. Banks were reluctant to lend them money, and investors avoided their companies. The men who had once been feared and respected were now seen as dangerous criminals who would betray anyone for profit. As the summer of 1871 approached, the stage was set for the greatest political scandal in American history. The evidence of massive corruption was ready to be published. The reformers were organized and determined, and public opinion was turning against the men who had ruled New York like kings. The golden age of unlimited corruption was about to end in a spectacular explosion that would destroy careers, topple governments, and send some of the most powerful men in America to prison or exile. Boss Tweed still believed he was untouchable, but his enemies were closing in from every direction, and soon there would be nowhere left for him to hide. July 1871 brought scorching heat to New York City, but the temperature was about to get much hotter for Boss Tweed and his corrupt empire. On a sweltering morning that would be remembered forever, the New York Times published the first in a series of articles that would destroy the most powerful political machine in American history and send shockwaves across the entire nation. The headline was simple but devastating. The newspaper declared that Boss Tweed and his associates had stolen over $6 million from the city treasury in just 2 years, and this was only the beginning of what they had discovered. Page after page of evidence showed exactly how the money had been stolen, with fake bills, phony contracts, and imaginary companies that existed only to funnel taxpayer money into the pockets of corrupt politicians. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Citizens who had suspected corruption but never seen proof were stunned by the scale of the theft. The courthouse project alone had cost taxpayers over $13 million, enough money to build dozens of schools or hospitals. Meanwhile, neighborhoods lacked basic services and poor families struggled to survive while Boss Tweed lived in luxury, paid for with their tax money. Boss Tweed's first reaction was rage, followed by desperate attempts to stop the newspaper attacks. He tried every method he had used successfully in the past. He offered George Jones even more money to stop the stories, reportedly as much as $5 million, a sum that would have made the newspaper editor one of the richest men in America. When Jones refused again, Tweed had city officials threaten to revoke the newspaper's business license and arrest its reporters on fake charges. But this time, Tweed's usual tactics failed completely. The evidence was too strong, the public anger was too great, and the reform movement had grown too powerful to be stopped by bribes or threats. Every day brought new revelations about the extent of the corruption, and each story made more citizens demand justice. Thomas Nast's cartoons in Harper's Weekly became even more savage and effective. His most famous drawing showed Boss Tweed and his associates as vultures picking clean the bones of New York City, while poor families starved in the background. Another cartoon depicted Tweed as a tiger, attacking helpless citizens while politicians looked the other way. These images spread across the country, making Boss Tweed the most hated man in America. The political consequences came swiftly. Reform. Candidates began organizing for the fall elections, promising to clean up city government and put the criminals in jail. Wealthy citizens who had previously ignored politics because they thought it did not affect them suddenly realized that corruption was costing them money too. Even some of Tweed's former allies began to distance themselves from him as public opinion turned completely against the corrupt machine. In October 1871, a grand jury issued warrants for the arrest of Boss Tweed and his key associates. When the police came to arrest him, Tweed seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would dare to treat him like a common criminal. For so many years, he had been above the law, able to buy judges and intimidate prosecutors. Now he found himself in handcuffs, facing charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The trial of Boss Tweed became the most famous court case of the 19th century. Newspapers across the country sent reporters to cover every detail of the proceedings. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Document after document showed how city money had been stolen through fake companies and inflated contracts. Witnesses testified about how they had been forced to pay bribes to get city jobs or contracts. Boss Tweed's lawyers tried every legal trick they could think of. They claimed the evidence was fake, that their client was being persecuted for political reasons, and that the amounts of money involved were much smaller than prosecutors claimed. But the paper trail was too clear, and the testimony too detailed for any of these arguments to succeed. In 1873, Boss Tweed was convicted of forgery and grand larceny. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison and ordered him to pay a fine of over $12,000. The man who had once controlled every aspect of New York City government was led away in chains to serve his sentence in the Ludlow Street jail. But even prison could not completely break Boss Tweed's spirit, or his connections. His political machine was destroyed and his associates had fled or been arrested, but he still had friends who owed him favors. In 1875, these friends managed to get him released from prison on a legal technicality, though he still faced civil charges that could keep him in jail for many more years. Tweed's freedom was brief and bitter. He found that the New York he returned to was completely different from the city he had once ruled. The reform movement had swept away most of his remaining supporters, and new laws made the kind of massive corruption he had practiced almost impossible. Former friends crossed the street to avoid talking to him, and newspapers followed his every move, ready to report any attempt to return to his old criminal activities. In December 1875, Boss Tweed was arrested again on civil charges related to his theft of city money. This time his bail was set at $3 million, an amount so large that even his remaining friends could not raise it. Tweed was returned to the Ludlow Street jail, where he would spend the rest of his life. Prison was a harsh experience for a man who had lived in luxury for so many years. Tweed's health began to fail under the stress and poor conditions. He tried several times to make deals with prosecutors, offering to reveal the secrets of other corrupt politicians in exchange for his freedom. But officials no longer trusted anything he said. In a desperate attempt to escape his fate, Boss Tweed made one final gamble. During a brief visit to his home under guard, he managed to escape from his captors and flee the country. He first went to Cuba, where he hoped to hide until the scandal died down, but American diplomats pressured the Cuban government to refuse him sanctuary. From Cuba, Tweed fled to Spain, where he thought he would be safe from American law enforcement. But even there, he could not escape the consequences of his crimes. The Spanish government, under pressure from the United States, arrested him in 1876 and sent him back to New York to face justice once again. Boss Tweed's final return to New York was very different from his departure. Instead of traveling in luxury as he had for so many years, he was brought back as a prisoner in chains. Crowds gathered to see the once mighty political boss reduced to a broken old man. The diamond pin that had once been his symbol of power was gone, sold to pay for his legal defense. The last years of Boss Tweed's life were spent in a small jail cell, his health failing and his empire completely destroyed. He died on April 12, 1878, from pneumonia, alone except for a few family members who still visited him. The man who had once controlled the fate of millions was buried in a simple grave, his name forever associated with corruption and greed. James Fisk met an even more dramatic end. In 1872, while the Tweed scandal was still unfolding, Fisk became involved in a dispute with a business partner named Edward Stokes over money and a woman they both loved. The argument escalated until Stokes shot and killed Fisk in the lobby of a Manhattan hotel. Jubilee Jim died as he had lived, in a blaze of publicity and scandal. Jay Gould survived longer than his partners, but his reputation never recovered from Black Friday and his betrayal of the other gold conspirators. He continued to make money through railroad investments and stock manipulation, but he was never again accepted in respectable society. When he died in 1892, newspapers described him as the most hated man in America, a title he had held for over 20 years. The Vanderbilt fortune continued its slower, but equally certain decline. Each generation spent more money than the previous. 1. Building bigger mansions, throwing more expensive parties, and making worse business decisions. By the 1890s, the family that had once been worth over $100 million was running out of money, and some family members were forced to sell their possessions and take jobs for the first time in their lives. The fall of these Gilded Age titans sent a clear message across America that no one was above the law and that corruption would eventually be exposed and punished. The age of unlimited greed and political corruption was ending, replaced by new laws and institutions designed to prevent such scandals from happening again. The 1880s dawned on a New York City that had been forever changed by the spectacular rise and fall of its Gilded Age titans. Where once the corrupt and powerful had ruled like kings, new laws and institutions now stood guard against the kind of massive theft and manipulation that had defined the previous era. The Golden Towers had fallen, but their shadows still stretched across American society, serving as both warning and reminder of what happens when greed grows larger than conscience. In the offices where Boss Tweed had once held court, politicians worked to rebuild trust in government. The new city charter had been rewritten to prevent any single person from gaining the kind of absolute power that Tweed had wielded. Financial records that had once been secret were now open to public inspection. Contracts that had once been awarded in backroom deals were now subject to competitive bidding and oversight. The courthouse that had been the symbol of Tweed's corruption was finally completed, though it had taken nearly twice as long and cost 50 times more than originally planned. Visitors to the building could see marble floors and crystal chandeliers that were beautiful, but would forever remind people of the price of allowing politicians to steal with impunity. The building stood as a monument not to civic pride but to the importance of honest government. Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist whose drawings had helped bring down Boss Tweed, continued his work fighting corruption wherever he found it. His cartoons had proven that art could be more powerful than armies when it came to changing public opinion. Other newspapers and magazines began hiring their own political cartoonists, understanding that pictures could reach people who might never read a written article. The New York Times, which had risked everything to expose the Tweed Ring, became one of the most respected newspapers in America. George Jones, the editor who had refused millions of dollars in bribes, was recognized as a hero who had chosen truth over personal profit. The newspaper's success proved that honest journalism could be both profitable and powerful, inspiring other publications to investigate corruption in their own cities and states. But the effects of the Gilded Age's collapse reached far beyond New York City. The Panic of 1893, which began 24 years after Black Friday, brought final reckoning to many of the remaining fortunes that had survived the earlier disasters. This economic depression was even worse than the gold panic, lasting for several years and destroying businesses across the entire country. Unemployment rose to 19% as factories closed and banks failed. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand their operations found themselves unable to repay their loans when crop prices collapsed. Railroad companies that had been symbols of American progress went bankrupt as freight traffic disappeared. Even some of the wealthiest families in America found their fortunes reduced to nothing almost overnight. The Vanderbilt family fortune, which had seemed so vast and permanent, finally began its most dramatic decline during this period. The younger generations had grown up believing that their wealth was unlimited, and they had never learned the hard work and careful planning that had created the family's success. Cornelius Vanderbilt's great-grandson would later admit that the family had spent money as if it grew on trees, never thinking that even the largest fortune could be exhausted. One by one, the magnificent Vanderbilt mansions were sold to pay debts or taxes. The furniture, artwork, and jewelry that had once been symbols of unlimited wealth were auctioned off to collectors and museums. Family members who had never worked a day in their lives were forced to find jobs or marry for money rather than love. The name that had once been synonymous with American success became a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking wealth for granted. Anderson Cooper, a television news anchor who was Cornelius Vanderbilt's great-great-great-grandson, would later tell people that his mother had made it clear to him from an early age that there was no trust fund waiting for him. The fortune that had once made the Vanderbilts the richest family in America had been completely spent by previous generations, leaving nothing for their descendants but famous names and faded photographs. The mansions that had housed the Gilded Age elite found new purposes in the changing world. Some became museums where visitors could see how the super-rich had lived during America's first Gilded Age. Others were converted into apartment buildings or offices, their grand ballrooms and elaborate staircases serving new and more practical purposes. A few were torn down completely, replaced by modern buildings that served the needs of a more democratic society. The Payne Whitney Mansion, which had been one of the most spectacular homes on Fifth Avenue, became the Cultural Services Building of the French Embassy. The house that had once hosted parties costing more than most people earned in a lifetime now served the cause of international diplomacy and cultural exchange. Visitors who came for official events walked through rooms where Gilded Age millionaires had once plotted business deals and political schemes. Progressive era reforms that emerged from the ashes of Gilded Age corruption fundamentally changed how American business and government operated. Antitrust laws were passed to prevent any single company or individual from gaining too much power over entire industries. Banking regulations were created to prevent the kind of financial manipulation that had caused Black Friday and countless other market panics. Civil service reform meant that government jobs could no longer be bought and sold like commodities. Public employees had to pass examinations and meet qualifications rather than simply paying bribes to political bosses. Financial disclosure laws required politicians to reveal their sources of income and potential conflicts of interest. The Federal Reserve System was established to provide stability to American banking and prevent the kind of economic chaos that had marked the Gilded Age. Securities regulations made it illegal to manipulate stock and commodity markets the way Jay Gould and James Fisk had manipulated gold prices. These new institutions were not perfect, but they made it much harder for small groups of wealthy individuals to control entire markets for their personal benefit. Labor unions gained strength as working people realized that they needed to organize to protect themselves from employers who valued profits more than human welfare. Child labor laws were passed to prevent young children from being forced to work in dangerous factories. Workplace safety regulations were created after too many workers had died in preventable accidents. Women's suffrage movements gained momentum, as reformers argued that corruption thrived, partly because half the population was excluded from the political process. If women could vote, reformers reasoned, they might choose more honest candidates and support laws that protected families rather than enriching the already wealthy. Immigration laws were reformed to prevent the kind of exploitation that political machines like Tammany Hall had practiced on new Americans. While the reforms were not always fair or effective, they represented recognition that democracy could not survive if large groups of people were treated as resources to be exploited, rather than citizens to be served. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked America's emergence as a world power, but it also showed how much the country had changed since the Gilded Age. The war was managed by professional civil servants rather than political cronies, and military contracts were awarded through competitive bidding rather than corrupt backroom deals. While problems certainly remained, the worst excesses of the Gilded Age had been largely eliminated. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, Americans could look back on the Gilded Age with a mixture of shame and pride. They were ashamed of how corruption had been allowed to flourish and how much suffering had been caused by the greed of powerful men. But they were also proud of how the country had learned from these mistakes and built institutions designed to prevent them from happening again. The men who had once seemed so mighty were now remembered mainly as warnings about what could happen when power was not balanced by responsibility. Boss Tweed's name became synonymous with political corruption. Jay Gould was remembered as a symbol of ruthless financial manipulation. The Vanderbilt family's decline served as a reminder that no fortune, however large, could survive unlimited waste and poor decisions. But their stories also showed the strength of American democracy. When corruption was exposed, the system had eventually responded with reform. When powerful men abused their positions, they were ultimately held accountable for their crimes. The press had proven it could challenge the mighty, and ordinary citizens had shown they could organize to demand better government. As people walked through the streets of New York in the 1890s, they passed buildings and monuments that told the story of the Gilded Age's rise and fall. Former palaces of corruption had been transformed into schools and hospitals. Parks that had been built with stolen money now served all citizens equally. The city itself had become a living memorial to both the dangers of unchecked power and the possibility of reform and renewal. The Golden Age was over, but the lessons it taught would echo through American history for generations to come, reminding future leaders that in a democracy, no one stays on top forever, and justice, though sometimes slow, eventually finds its way to every door.